Thanks. Senator Wells.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to have a little bit of a preamble on this, and I'm going to ask Mr. Doer, as a former politician, and really that headspace never leaves the political world. In your opening, you had mentioned you mentioned angst, you mentioned existential crisis a couple of times, and then a third time when you were answering one of the questions, you talked about billions of people are trying to get off other fuels. You mentioned cow dung and coal and others. And I'm not sure they're trying to get off. They're just trying to survive. In India, they just want warm food and a warm home. So I'm not sure if they're really trying to get off. Maybe the government is, but the 1.4 billion people maybe not. So there's and as well in China and other large consuming nations. Canada's global emissions are 1.5%. 10 years ago, they were 1.6%. Our percentage is going down, which is laudable, but our percentage is going down because others are going up. So I'm wondering if the massive high cost of bringing us from 1.6 to 1.5, and maybe our next target is 1.45. How much of a difference is this making globally when we're probably, well, we are. I looked it up, the top emitters, well, China, USA, and India, they're about 60% of global emissions. We're 1.5 and decreasing. The EU is fourth, so that's 27 countries. Russia, Indonesia, Brazil, Japan, Iran, then Canada. So we're about 40th in global emissions. We're nothing. We're nothing. If you removed Canada from the map entirely, our emissions elimination would make no difference to global emissions. In fact, I would think that if Canada was removed, global emissions would increase because our technology, our clean fuel, all the things that we supply to the world, Mr. Spady mentioned many of them, would disappear. We're well regulated. I know in the Newfoundland offshore, we don't have to remove the oil from the sand. We don't need rail. We don't need pipelines. We just put it to market, and it's easy. And it requires no refining. It's the color of apple juice. And it's inexpensive to remove from the Are we going down a path where, and we hear it from politicians all the time, that the world is burning. The world is burning, and we had the minister in 2 weeks ago, and I'm sorry for the longer preamble, but none of my other colleagues are here, so I'm going to take some of their time. We had Minister Guilbeault in here a couple of weeks ago talking about the Jasper fires, which is, it's an important topic for us, and about climate change. And when questioned about the recommendations that were made to his department on removal of deadwood that had been there for years, drying out for years, and that the fire was caused by lightning, I'm going to be pushed hard to agree that it was climate change that caused the fires in Jasper. All to say is, are we putting in way too much? And I like the idea of the market having a big say in the energy mix, recognizing there's a transition, there's a global consensus on transition. Are we putting too much? Are we spending just these massive amounts? And you mentioned some funds that were available. Is Canada going down the wrong path? Is the juice worth the squeeze?
Well, you've given me, Senator Wells, a lot to respond to. In many respects, I would have to concur in principle with what you have just said in your preamble. We used to think in Canada, and our industry was correct in saying early on, when we had all the methane regulations and other regulations, and just south of the border they didn't, we were at a disadvantage. Canadians operated at an economic disadvantage to most jurisdictions in the world. I remember not that long ago when we would hear out of Europe, oh, dirty Canadian oil, when in fact most of that was just offshoring the oil out of Russia. So that was a reality. And there's so much being said, there's so much discussion, and when you cut through the top of it and you get down to the reality, it's a very, very different picture. I would concur that someone in India is probably just wanting to heat their home with kerosene or do whatever. But they are trying to get off it because it's not a very effective way of doing it. There are a lot of other particulate issues and other things. They would like to have other sources of energy. The point being, though, I try to not be sidetracked by a discussion of whether climate change is caused by some sunspots or climate change is caused by carbon. Bottom line is we know that carbon is a warming element, and we know that that's the case. There may be other factors. The bottom line, and I always just say, don't we want to pollute less? Don't we want to be as good as we can be? And Canada's, what I said to our industry, Canada's problem over the last 10, 15 years in that we were overregulated relative to the rest of the world is now a significant advantage to us because we are, if not best in class, close to best in class on almost all fronts. Your point about Canada being a very, very small part of global emissions is absolutely correct. That's factually correct. The point and how it relates to what we're saying is that if you think of the dollars that we spend to squeeze out that last little bit in Canada and what we could do if we applied even a portion of those dollars internationally in supporting those countries that don't have the resources to deal with their low-hanging fruit, we could have a much greater outsized impact over anything that we could do here in Canada. And it is a global ecosystem. So the bottom line is if we stop, to your point, if we stop production in Canada, someone would just fill the gap. The reality is, again, fundamental fact, there are a lot of countries in the world that are still buying Russian oil despite the sanctions because it's cheap and they need it. There will always be someone coming to fill that gap. I spent a lot of my time in Latin America working with companies to introduce our clean technologies because they usually improve operations as well. No one is reducing production in those jurisdictions. You look at Africa right now, all around Africa, and internal to the continent, but all around as well, offshore, they're all increasing production. The African Chamber of Commerce recently said, I hope we don't get into a discussion which is around environmental, what's the term I'm searching for? Anyway, bottom line is they didn't want colonialism, environmental colonialism. They said, are you going to tell us we can't develop, we can't replace our imports? Are you going to tell us that we can't earn money, that we should rely on aid? That came out of the African Chamber of Commerce. And it's similar around the world. So bottom line is, I believe we should be the best we can be. But to sit here and pretend that if we just do this, we've met our global commitments and the world is going to get better is kidding ourselves. If we took a portion of that, and if we even took the existing money, our international financial institution money, you could talk to most of our trade people around the world, the Canadian trade people. We are the only country of any significance that does not tie its aid to its priorities. And there is nothing in our aid that is tied to the environment, to emission reduction. And yet I can tell you that the competitive countries that we're dealing with, Mr. Spacey mentioned, the United States, US aid goes in there, provides all kinds of money to, US companies to do work in these jurisdictions. We're so good at this, and we're not having the impact that we should. So that's the change that's needed. I don't want to get into a real debate around the details of what, where Canada sits. We're a relatively small portion, but our impact could be huge if we choose to change our practices and choose to focus on where the low-hanging fruit is. And frankly, that's mostly outside of Canada.
Mr. Spady, did you want to add?
I'll simply add that Al referred to outsized impact, and I think the multiplier here, in direct answer to your question, is the leadership and experience we have. We can actually multiply our impact more than just 1 or 2 times by taking our technology and our expertise abroad and we can change that 1% to 10% of the world's emissions using our skills. Thank you.
Senator Wells?
Thank you. Thanks, Chair, for giving me a second question, given my first one was really long. You said Canada should be the best it can be. It's a great aspirational statement. When we had the officials from Environment and Climate Change here back in May or June of this year, and I asked the question, how much is this project of reducing Canada's emissions? What does that cost? And they said $4 trillion. They corrected themselves because they weren't sure, and they came back and said $2 trillion afterwards. But $2 trillion and $4 trillion, it's the same number. It's trillions. It goes back to my earlier question, like on are we getting bang for the buck? It seems to me that doing things with reduction of emissions, that's really important. It's really great, but there's a limit. You want the best food for your kids, but will you spend $1,000 a day to get the best food? No, you'll do that risk management exercise in your head. The top 3 sources of carbon emissions: burning fossil fuel, so that's for heat. For burning fossil fuel for electricity, transportation. Are we going to, would we deliberately choose to eliminate that, go with electric, go with the higher mining costs, not just dollar costs, but costs in lives, because most of that's coming out of China and Africa, probably without the well-regulated environment that we have in Canada for oil and gas, for sure, and I know that intimately. My question is, how does Canada grapple with us trying to slice our 1.5% down to 1.4 for trillions of dollars, when the other 98.5% we have no effect on unless we continue to produce? Because Canada's the 4th largest petroleum producer, and most of it goes to export. If we don't produce that and put it in the globe, then Venezuela, which has no environmental standards, the west coast of Africa, which has no environmental or labor standards, Russia, not even a discussion about that. So removing Canada from that mix, which is what the government's trying to do, and many others, when they say, there's rising sea levels and the islands will disappear in 40 years, and they said that 40 years ago. I'm trying to grapple with what we're doing to ourselves when we're a solution country, not a problem country.